I'm kind of a sucker for the big political fantasy epic style storytelling thing. I was watching a show like that a while back, and it did this thing that we were talking about yesterday where you flip sympathies by overreacting to something. And there was a situation where there's a city full of people who are smug and controlling, and they promote bad policy and injustice. And it's just generally kind of a symbol of oppression and a really unlikable place. But then later on in the show, somebody comes and they're like, I'm going to clean this town up. And you're like, yeah, somebody needs to do something. But then the cleanup gets a little bit out of hand, and then a lot out of hand. And at some point in that sequence where the cleanup gets way out of hand and the justice dishing out gets way out of hand, you as a viewer start to feel uncomfortable, and you're like, this is disorienting. What the heck is going on here? Okay, that's enough. It's one thing to be like, that was wrong and we won't stand for it. It's another thing to do whatever the heck it is that we're doing here. Oh my goodness, I don't know what to think about anything anymore. And if you go and take an honest historical read on the relationship between Christians and the Jewish people over the course of the last couple thousand years, what you will see is overwhelmingly peaceable and sympathetic relations. That's the truth of the matter. Most of the time, stuff was just fine. People working together, making each other richer, no big deal. But if you look at some of those flare-ups and high points and institutional conflicts, you will see something that starts out where you're like, dang, those religious leaders, they really wronged Jesus. It'd be nice to see them have to answer for that in some way, or acknowledge that they got it wrong or what they did. You'll see it go from that to a place where you're like, I really want some justice, to a place where like it seems like it evens out, to a place in the Middle Ages and beyond where you're like, oh, wow. I kind of feel some sympathy here for the Jewish people. I think those religious leaders were wrong for what they did to Jesus, but dang, some weird stuff has been done in the name of Jesus back to the Jewish people, and Jesus was Jewish. I feel weird and conflicted and disoriented, kind of like I did in the last episode of that season of that show that I was talking about. It's too much. It's gone too far. And as we discussed, the passage that is often sloppily invoked by people along the way who've wanted to do really not kingdom values, not Christian things to Jewish people is right here in Matthew 27. Pilate says, I'm washing my hands of the blood of Jesus. And all the people answered, let his blood be on us and on our children. Now, look, the people who use that to say that Jewish people deserve some sort of mistreatment for all of time, it doesn't make a lick of sense. And unfortunately, I've even run into a couple people who actually still think that somehow over the course of the last couple of weeks, which is mind-boggling to me. But okie dokie, I guess that means we need to take a little extra time to sort this one out, and I don't think it's really all that hard. First of all, what does the phrase all the people mean in this context? Well, I hear some people say, well, it means all the Jews. How is that possible? Did all of the Jews fit into the temple courtyard area? They did not. That is a physical impossibility. Other people were elsewhere doing work and stuff. It can't possibly mean all of the Jews. That's absurd. It means all the people who were in the room. Does it literally mean that? Well, no. We can deduce that there were people who were there who were in support of Jesus and didn't say that. There's actually a name for the literary technique being employed here. It's an age-old one. It's called hyperbole. It's the thing that we all use in daily parlance, and it's where you make an extreme statement to illustrate a point. So if somebody's complimenting somebody else for working hard, they might say something like, she's in the gym every single day. Well, not every single day. I mean, she's sick sometimes, travels sometimes, takes a rest day sometimes. That's part of the plan as well. Hyperbole. It's a big, obvious overstatement that indicates the impulse or the spirit of a thing. That's what we're getting here. Matthew's trying to communicate that it was pretty overwhelming. It looked like consensus. Everybody was yelling this stuff. And by everybody, I mean pretty much most everybody. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this is not hyperbole and that every single person in that courtyard was yelling, give us Barabbas, crucify Jesus, his blood be on our hands, ours and our children. Even if that's the case, how is that somehow legally binding, let alone legally binding for people who aren't even born yet? That is absurd. That isn't how things work. And some might point to stuff in the Old Testament. There's generational guilt. There's the idea of people hurting the Hebrews or the Israelites, and then God being like, I'm going to punish those people to this generation and the next, or I'm going to hold the sons and the grandsons accountable for the sins of the father. But even there, we're getting into a different theological place where God used the nations freely to punish or even to reward his own chosen people per the terms of the Mosaic covenant that we've discussed so many times. So God is inflicting his supernatural will over the top of the will of other people to guide the hearts of kings like a watercourse and use them the way he wants to use them. Is that happening here? Sure, but it's a little different dynamic than the stuff that flows out of the tension between the Hebrew people and the nations surrounding them out of the deal that is struck with the Mosaic covenant. Additionally, there is a theological pivot that is happening here. Instead of this idea of a sacrifice that kind of covers all the sins of one ethnic group that you do once a year to kind of catch anything that might have been missed, now we're talking about a totally new deal under Jesus, the completion of those ideas of sacrifice and atonement and forgiveness in the Old Testament. Now you're talking about something that doesn't really work and isn't really litigatable in terms of collective guilt. You're talking about a new covenant, a new arrangement between God and man. And so it's not possible to just take those examples from the Old Testament and in a neat, tidy way drop them into the New Testament and be like, well, you have a new covenant, but also you still have the ethnic guilt for the Jewish people that goes forward with them forever. You kind of got to pick one or the other in that regard. But then on top of that, we got to think about Matthew in context here, because this isn't the first time we've had some kind of interaction about the collective guilt of a certain subset of Jews. Remember that entire verbal beatdown that Jesus gives the Pharisees and the religious leaders back here in chapter 23. In that passage, Jesus is demonstrating a through line through all of history, the law, the prophets, everything that happened before, between the religious leaders of the past who were hard-hearted and obstructed the work of God and the current religious leaders. He is not drawing a through line between every single Jewish human who ever existed and every single current Jewish human who existed at that time and every single Jewish human who would ever exist in the future. It just isn't what he's saying. So in light of what we read in Matthew chapter 23, it seems like what Matthew's paying off in chapter 27 is the failure of this broken mediator between God and man. Now, Jesus is mediator between God and man, and he's just one guy. It's not a whole team. It's not a whole religious caste or group of people. It's one mediator between God and man, and he gets it done. But the rival mediator between God and man, the state-appointed one, is a group of people. It's an organization. It's an intellectual, spiritual, vocational tradition. And Matthew and Jesus are going out of their way to demonstrate the complete failure of that tradition to do what it's supposed to do, and to demonstrate the complete success of Jesus to do what he's supposed to do. So when that tradition in this scene in Matthew 27 embraces the guilt for killing Jesus, it's happening in the context of that contrast. Still, in spite of that, Jesus flips right around and Luke tells us, he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. I've heard some people be like, no, he was only talking about the Romans. What? Well, why? Where are you getting that from contextually? The religious leaders are right there in Luke 23 when Jesus says the stuff about forgiveness, and they're mentioned in the 2 sentences after he says it. Ultimately, the bottom line is this. The New Testament teaches very clearly that there is a new deal between God and man, that the culminating event, the blood event that made that deal happen, that realized it, that consummated it, is Jesus on the cross. With this new deal, God can still forgive, show grace, mercy to whomever he pleases. I mean, that's kind of the point of that parable about the workers who come at different times. I mean, that's within God's nature, and it's his business to show grace, patience, long-sufferingness with whomever he wants, however he wants. But as it's spelled out to us throughout the rest of the New Testament, each and every Jewish person, as is the case with any man or woman of any ethnic background, each individual, any individual who is made right with God, is made right because of the work of Jesus on the cross, his sacrifice there, solidified by his resurrection from the dead, demonstrating that what he did there actually was efficacious. So this idea of some sort of collective, inherited, generational guilt that is handed on forever and ever, that some have imagined is passed on far beyond even the Old Testament notion of 1 or 2 generations, this idea of guilt doesn't square neatly with what we learn from the New Testament about what the new deal is between God and humanity, the way God is building this new family of faith. So what we're getting in Matthew 27 is the religious leadership definitively saying, we want to own this. We believe it is right. We are not even being shy about it. He is not the mediator between God and man. We are. And then with the resurrection and all the other events that are coming along with and after that, God is going to vindicate Jesus, and he is going to demonstrate the foolishness and lies of the religious leadership who were on the wrong side of this issue at every turn. The contrast, then, is not meant to create some notion of being mad at some other people group for all of eternity. The contrast is meant to prompt the reader to say, whose side would I want to be on? The side of what is beautiful and just and right and built on the values of a kingdom I want to be a part of, the side that seems to have the words of life and the ability to give life, or the side of something that was based on lies and power and manipulation and control, and that was demonstrated to clearly be wrong on this issue. Certainly, Jews and Christians have a very different assessment of Jesus of Nazareth, and I think we should just lean right into that. But certainly that is no justification for hatred, mistreatment, or even violence between these two groups. The values of the kingdom include peace and patience, even toward those who do not believe in the king at all. That's a doozy. Every now and then we get to tackle stuff like that. On to a different topic next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.